All right, my friends. Well, we're going to start a new series of messages today in the book of Exodus. And this is not an astronaut. That's what I thought at first. But he's a hiker. It's a backpack on his back. He's got some cargo pants on. And he is about to cross chaotic waters. Exodus, Road to Freedom. We'll talk more about, today will be an introduction into the book itself. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Usually we have a sermon illustration at the beginning of each message, and we will have that during this series as well. But like we did last year in our Genesis series, these sermon illustrations will mostly be historical stuff from outside the Bible that helps us understand the culture, the times, helps us connect the Bible to actual real history, because the Bible is actual real history. So for our sermon illustration today, I'm going to jump right into this big question. If you don't know the story of Exodus, that's okay. We'll get to it in a minute. But what you just need to know now is that it's all about a showdown between God, the Lord, Moses as his prophet, and the Pharaoh of ancient Egypt. Pharaoh is the king, the God king. And there's this big question: who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? The book of Exodus itself does not tell us his name. And we actually know, we meaning, the human race, archaeologists, scholars, know a ton about the history of ancient Egypt. So much, you could probably never read it all in your whole life. And so we know who all the pharaohs were. So which one is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? There is some debate. I'm no scholar, but I've looked into this quite deeply. And I am going to go with one person in particular. If you know your pharaohs, which probably none of you do. I don't know my pharaohs. But if you were someone who really knew your pharaohs, you would look at that statue and you would know exactly who it is immediately. Anybody got it? Oh, good. Somebody's got it. It's Ramses II. Yes, good job in the front. The Pharaoh of the Exodus is almost certainly, I'm just going to say certainly, it just almost has to be Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. And Ramses was the pharaoh he was actually pharaoh for a very long time. He reigned for somewhere between 66 and 70 years as pharaoh. He reigned in the 13th century BC. We'll talk about that time period more in a few minutes. But that's the 1200s BC, which has got to be, there is some debate about the timing of the Exodus as well, but I think it's got to be in the 1200s for a number of reasons. And Ramses the Great is a very well-known pharaoh. Let me tell you a few things about him. You'll see some of the reasons that I think it's Ramses the Great. You'll see right in the text as we go through it today. In a few minutes, we'll get to Exodus chapter 1. But some things about Ramses the Great and his life. As a young man, he was one of the most militant of the Egyptian pharaohs. He was a great military commander. And here he is on the wall of a temple in Egypt, a depiction of him, and he's got all of his enemies by the hair. He's conquered them all. This represents actually 3 different kingdoms that he had conquered. And so he did tons from the time he became pharaoh as a teenager. He just went on campaign after campaign. And we talked before, you'll remember some things about pharaohs, I'm sure, from the Genesis series, or maybe stuff you already know. The pharaoh, unlike most kings in the ancient Near East, the pharaoh in Egypt was considered to be a god. Not just that he represented the gods, or not just that he was blessed by the gods. He was a god himself, the god Amun-Ra. And so the pharaoh was brought up believing this. And there is one incident in his life as a relatively young man in his mid to late 20s. Ramses II had a great military battle against the Hittite Empire, the Battle of Kadesh. And in this battle, this will show you kind of his mindset and what kind of a guy he was as a young man. In this battle, the Hittites attacked, and they had overwhelming force. They had more chariots than the Egyptians, and they broke the Egyptian lines. That means the Egyptian soldiers were running for their lives. Anybody who looked at that battle would have said, and they did, that battle is over. The Egyptians have lost. They're going to be just cut down as they flee back to Egypt. But Ramses believed that he was a god on earth. What would a god on earth do if your army is losing a battle? Well, you'd go win it all by yourself, right? You are God. Why not go win it? And so this is what Ramses did. He rode out in his personal chariot. This is the only instance we know of like this, I think, in Egyptian history. Because pharaohs did not usually, sometimes they fought, but not usually on the front lines. He charged the Hittite lines by himself in his chariot, believing that he was the god Amun-Ra, and he could defeat them all. And it turned his own army. When his own soldiers who believed he was a god saw him charging, they all turned around and stopped running away, and the Egyptians won the battle. And so then afterwards, they all believed even more that he was this god on earth. He must have firmly believed that after this great victory. But later in his life, things did not go so well for him. Later in his life, very famously, Ramses the Great signed the first real peace treaty in history. So about 20 years later, he signed a peace treaty with that same Hittite empire. And it's a real peace treaty. Like it includes things like, we're going to be allies, and if somebody attacks you, we'll come attack and fight with you on both sides. These were with his sworn enemies. This is something no other pharaoh had done. We look at it and see it as, okay, a peace treaty, that's a great step in human progress, right? But that's not how ancient people saw it. Why would the god Amun-Ra have to sign a peace treaty with somebody? Doesn't that mean he's weak? Doesn't that mean he's not really the god he says he is? There's a number of things in his later life, including this big event. Egyptians, there's a lot we don't know about Egyptian history, even though they recorded so much, because Egyptians never recorded bad news. It was just against the law in ancient Egypt to record bad news. So if something bad happened, you just don't talk about it. And Ramses' eldest son, who was his military commander, Ramses is in his 40s, his eldest son is probably in his 20s at this point, and he was his military commander, and somehow this eldest son died, and we don't know how. Now, if you know the stories in Exodus, there's a lot of stuff about eldest sons dying, isn't there? Lots of stuff. Later in his life, Ramses, there's some hints that he was very inactive later in his reign. He was probably depressed in some ways. Something changed. Something huge changed in his life. From the early days when he was the great victor, the God on earth, to later in his reign when he just didn't really believe he could do anything. Could what happened in his reign possibly be what we see in the book of Exodus? I think absolutely it is. Last thing I'll tell you about pharaohs, and there is a question. Exodus says that Pharaoh died in the Red Sea. We'll get to that later in the book. When Moses and the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, Pharaoh died. This is just a point it's huge. The word Pharaoh in Egyptian does not actually mean king. It's not what they called their king originally. We talked about this in the series in Genesis. Pharaoh just means big house. I actually think it's probably because of the Israelites and other slave peoples that this term came to be. Instead of calling their ruler like His Majesty or his actual official title, they called him Big House. Kind of like, you can think of Americans might sometimes call their president the big guy, right? It's almost like a term where you feel separate from this great leader, and you kind of, to make him maybe not so scary, or I don't know, you come up with this slang term for him. And that's actually what the word Pharaoh means. And so it could be that they called actually more than one person Big House. You could see, and this is why there's some questions as we go through the history later. You'll see that later in the series. There's some questions, if Pharaoh's eldest son died, did he die in the plague where all the firstborn were killed? Or who died in the Red Sea? Because Ramses himself certainly didn't die in the Red Sea. But it could well be that not only was Ramses called Pharaoh by the Israelites, but you could easily see they might call his son Pharaoh as well. Because where did his son live? In the big house, just like dad. Interesting. So all kinds of questions. We'll come back to that later. Who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? It's Ramses the Great in some way, but may also be his son or other sons in the palace. Ramses had a lot of kids, probably like 1,000 kids, something like that. Imagine having 1,000 children. Wow. You really would have to think you're a god on earth to have 1,000 children. So what we're going to do today in Exodus, we're going to do an intro. The series, the title for the message today is Intro and Oppression. So we're going to do some introduction and we're going to do some oppression. Okay, that's exciting. Oppression meaning just Exodus chapter 1, which is all about the oppression of the Israelites and how that came to be. But first we'll do a little intro to the book, give you some information about it, a little bit more than we've already said about the times, when this happened, what the world was like. We'll look very briefly at an overview of the story of the book, and then we'll draw some lessons from chapter 1. This is going to be a powerful series as we go through. Reminders where we're at in Genesis, because Exodus really is Genesis part 2, right? So Genesis was the story of how God created the world, and then human beings rebelled against God and spiraled into darkness. God tried to start over with a flood, but we still spiraled into darkness once again and sin. Eventually, we had this series last year called The Good, the Bad, and the Faithful, right? God is the good and the creation at the beginning. This is what we called our Genesis series. The bad is all the stuff that people do. And the faithful are a few people who hear the voice of God. And they're not exactly good people. They're messed up people just like all of us, but they hear God's voice and they exercise faith. Abraham is the first one recorded to do that in the chronology in Genesis. He follows God's lead, even though it's scary, and he's not all that great of a guy. There's lots of messed up stuff in Abraham's life. But through those who are faithful, not perfect, but faithful, God can restore the world. That's the message of Genesis. And so when we get into, we went through Abraham and Isaac in Genesis, and the calling on Abraham's life. Abraham originally called him. He sent him out. He was going to make him into a blessing to the world, right? God's going to use him to restore the whole world. Skip through some of this. There was this hint in Genesis, right in the middle of the book, that God is, another big theme in Genesis, God is in control of all of history. And God always knew that the Israelites were going to end up in Egypt as slaves. And in fact, there's this moment in Genesis that I want to remind you of, where God actually tells Abraham what's going to happen way before, hundreds of years before it happens. This is in a kind of a deep moment between the Lord and Abraham. And it says, then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, Abraham, you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here." That is back to what is today Israel, the land of Canaan, that they would be brought back to, because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. We're not going to dig deep into that, but that was the promise. That was part of the promise to Abraham. God knew ahead of time all this oppression we're going to see that was happening in Egypt for the Israelites. It was not a surprise to God. He knew that's what would happen ahead of time. God is, in fact, sovereign over history and our lives. Later, of course, in Genesis, we had Abraham's son Isaac, and then Jacob, and then Joseph. And Joseph is the one who had all the dreams, and eventually, through a lot of suffering, right, and a lot of faith, Joseph is incredibly faithful. Joseph becomes second in command to the Pharaoh of Egypt. He saves the nation of Egypt from a great famine, and then eventually he brings the whole family down to Egypt. And that is where the book of Exodus starts. But let's talk a little bit about the book at first. Exodus itself. The word Exodus means, it is a Greek word. It was not actually the original name for the book. The name that the Hebrews called it, they just called it the book of names, because the very first word in Exodus is names. These are the names of the Israelites who went down to Egypt. But later on, the Jewish people who are speaking Greek, probably in Egypt later, renamed it in Greek to the term Exodus. And Exodus just means the way out. Literally means the way out. The way out of something. Hodos is a way or a road, and ex is out. So the out way, the way out. You could also think of it, and that's why I've titled it this way, as a little bit more robustly, a road to freedom. Because what God did with the Israelites in Egypt, not only did he free them from slavery in Egypt, but he also set them free from lots of other things. He set them, maybe not fully, but partly free from sin, actually, from a system of false belief that they were trapped in, believing in all these gods who were, they had to serve them, and they were the lowest, and these gods were the high ones. God set them free from all of that. He set them free in a way that set an example for the world around them. And we'll actually see as we go through this, there's a lot of evidence that even though the Exodus is hard to pin down and find direct evidence for, there's a lot of evidence that the Exodus changed the course of history. The nations around, suddenly, very suddenly, regular people in nations all around the ancient Near East, just after the time of the Exodus, very suddenly, people start thinking, hey, I could overthrow this king who's been oppressing us for all these years. And there are tons of rebellions in the ancient Near East in the century after the Exodus. Is that a surprise? No. All these people had just watched what they believed to be impossible. A nation of slaves overcame the most powerful nation in the world. What does that do to you in your life? People started to think, maybe I can overcome the oppression in my life. It's a powerful example. In fact, in this series, we're going to think of it this way. In the Exodus, God, through Moses and the Israelites, it's like he built a road to freedom that other people can follow. Not the exact same road. We're not going to walk through the desert. But a road to freedom from different kinds of oppression, things that oppress us. Exodus is an example of how we can follow God in faith and overcome things even in our own lives, and perhaps even in our own society. Powerful ideas in Exodus. Freedom from Pharaoh and freedom from sin. Not complete freedom from sin. The Israelites were stuck in this pattern, and we are even still stuck in sin in some ways today, though we have been completely set free in Christ. All right, let me tell you a little bit about the 1200s BC. This is when the Exodus happens. Like I said, there is some debate on this, but I'm going to not talk about the debate much because I am firmly convinced it happened in the 1200s under Ramses the Great. Here's some other stuff that was happening in the 1200s. Just a little quick picture, fly around the world. It is pretty much the same time. It's just slightly before the Trojan War. So if you think of like the Iliad and all of that stuff that happened, Odysseus coming back from the Trojan War, all that stuff, just a little bit before the Trojan War, which was in kind of the same region of the world, not super far. This is some stuff. China had a large empire at the time, the Shang dynasty. And actually, in most ways, Egypt at the time was the most advanced civilization in the world. But China was actually the most technologically advanced civilization in the world at this time. This is an example of Chinese bronze casting from the 1200s. Really doesn't have directly anything to do with Exodus, but it's kind of cool to look at. Look at how intricate that is. That's a cast piece of bronze. I can't even imagine how you do such a thing. Amazing. Better than anything being produced in Egypt. But in other ways, Egypt was quite far ahead. India had previously had, in the millennium before, the 2000s BC, India had an empire that rivaled the Egyptians, but India had kind of fallen apart, the empire, and India was sort of in a dark age in the 1200s BC. Interesting. And this is a picture from Egypt. This kind of gives you a sense of what ancient Egypt was like. I'm sure you've seen lots of pictures like this before. Egypt in the 1200s was the oldest and most advanced, by many metrics, the most advanced civilization in the world. Not technologically. They actually weren't that great technologically. But in other ways, brute force, organization of their empire, armies, just producing food and things like that. Medicine, knowledge, writing, history, all kinds of things they were the most advanced in. Magic, actually, the most advanced in magic, which isn't even real, right? But they thought it was, and everybody back then did. Here's some key people in Exodus, some key people in the story as we go through the book. Moses is a very key figure in Exodus. There he is with his staff. God gives him a staff. We'll see that later. Pharaoh is a very key figure in Exodus. Which Pharaoh is that? Ramses II. Yeah, Ramses II. That is an actual depiction of him. Some other key figures in Exodus, Aaron and Miriam. These are Moses' brother and sister. That's right, brother and sister. They will factor into the story quite a lot. And then, of course, we can't leave out the most important player in this book, and that is the Lord. The Lord. And as we go through Exodus, we are going to be referring to him mostly as the Lord, rather than just God. Because the term Lord, the Hebrew term that we tend to translate as Lord, plays a very big role in the book of Exodus, a very big role. God, you will know at the burning bush, this is when God appears to Moses. God very famously tells Moses his name at the burning bush. And we translate that name Lord. We'll get to it. We'll discuss it more when we get there. Yahweh, sometimes referred to as Jehovah. But the ancient Israelites probably said Yahweh as the name. We translate that Lord with all capital letters. In your Bible, when you're reading Exodus or reading anywhere in the Bible, if you see the word Lord in most modern English translations and it's all capital letters, that is an indication it is a translation of the divine name from Hebrew. If it's capital L and then lowercase O-R-D, it's a different word. But they actually give you that little tool to help you see where the name of God is used in the Old Testament. Interesting. Okay, and then the story. Most of you will know the story of Exodus, but here it is, just in its basic outline. In the beginning of Exodus, you have the Israelites. They're oppressed in Egypt. They have hard slavery. A lot of the story in Exodus focuses on Moses, actually most of it. Moses is born, and then he's adopted. The Pharaoh's trying to kill everybody. We'll see that in a minute. He's trying to kill all the male babies of the Israelites. Moses grows up. He grows up in the household of Pharaoh. He grows up as an Egyptian ruler or prince or noble. And then eventually he kills a slave master to defend his own biological people, the Hebrews. And then he runs away to the desert. And he stays in the desert until he's how old? Anybody remember? 80 years old. Yeah, Moses stays in the desert until he's 80 years old. You think you've been discouraged or depressed in your life? Moses was like, I quit. I give up. I'm never coming back. And then when he's 80, God shows up in his life in this powerful way at the moment of the burning bush. He is sent back to Egypt. He has this massive showdown, a showdown between Pharaoh and the Lord. It's not actually a showdown between Moses and Pharaoh. The big question is, who is really God? Is Pharaoh really God, or is the Lord God? And that is answered dramatically in these plagues. Moses then leads the people out of Egypt in the actual Exodus, the literal way out. The way out of Egypt, they leave, they cross the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is destroyed in the Red Sea. They get to Mount Sinai. They go to a mountain. We'll be talking about that a lot. This is kind of where our series will end up in March. We'll finish up with the 10 Commandments and the laws that are given. We won't do the last couple pieces in this series. Much of the book of Exodus is dedicated to the tabernacle, the tent that the Israelites would bring around with them, where they would meet with God, and all the details of the tent. And then the story of the golden calf. We're not actually going to get to those in this series. We'll stick with the rest of it, the main story of the actual Exodus, getting out and getting to the Mount Sinai. All right, so now let's jump in. Let's look at the oppression in Exodus chapter 1, and we will draw some conclusions from this oppression, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So here is the first part of Exodus chapter 1. It starts out, like I told you, in Hebrew, it's just the word, the names, right? These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. These are the 12 tribes that go down. It's actually Joseph that really brings them down, but Jacob comes with them. Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. So all of these guys, this is just pointing us back to what had happened in the book of Genesis. That's how the book begins. And all these Israelites end up down in Egypt. We had a discussion in Bible study. Our discussions in Bible study are so good. Notice that it's the descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Not necessarily everyone who went with them. They also had lots of people attached to their household, servants or slaves with them. This probably does not count women who went down with them or children. So you're really talking about hundreds or maybe even thousands of people that go down initially under Joseph while Jacob is still alive to Egypt. But 70 heads of families who are descendants of Jacob go down with that group. What happens in Egypt? Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in number, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And this is part of why it's important that we see there were quite a few Israelites even to begin with. They multiplied by immense numbers in Egypt. And this is actually possible, though it is rare that population booms like this happen. By the time the Exodus happens, you're talking about 500,000-600,000 men who are leaving Egypt. So we're talking probably somewhere on the order of 1.5, maybe even as many as 2 million people that exit Egypt. So when it says they were exceedingly fruitful and they multiplied greatly, that's no joke. They multiplied greatly in Egypt. Now they're there for a long time. And again, exactly how long they were there, there is a little bit of debate about that. Maybe look at that another day. They're so numerous, it says, that the land was filled with them. They no longer maybe are even able to be contained in the area that they had been assigned. When they first came down to Egypt, Joseph was in favor, right? So all the Israelites were his relatives. So Pharaoh was like, oh, your relatives are here. Let's give them good land. But of course, when Pharaoh saw Joseph's relatives, he was disgusted by them. This is an interesting fact about the difference in culture. The Egyptians, we talked about this in our Genesis series, the Egyptians hated body hair. They hated it. So men were always clean shaven. They plucked their eyebrows and painted on fake eyebrows. They waxed themselves. No body hair at all for most upper class Egyptians. And then the Israelites, the Hebrews, show up with big old bushy beards, like something out of Duck Dynasty. And the Egyptians were like, that is absolutely disgusting. And then all of their flocks of sheep and goats showed up. And the Egyptians only liked cows. Sheep and goats are gross. And they're like, this is the worst. So we're going to give them their own little land they can stay in, the land of Goshen. Have your flocks there. That's all cool. You do our work for us. We don't even want to see you. We certainly don't want to smell you. So that was initially under Joseph, but now they have increased so much, it's likely they are overflowing the land of Goshen at this point. Then a new king, a new Pharaoh, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. This is actually interesting right here. I'm always looking for these linguistic moments where this is not the word Pharaoh. So even if Pharaoh might refer to more than one person, this probably, in my mind, refers to Ramses the Great. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us, and they stink. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. This also fits very well with the picture of the 1200s BC and Ramses. Ramses, remember I said, was fighting against the Hittites, okay? The Hittites actually are more closely related to the Israelites than they are to the Egyptians. So what Ramses is saying here is, I'm worried if the Hittites come down and attack us again, the Israelites might join them because they're kind of their cousins. The Hittites all have big beards and a lot of sheep too. They're going to go join the Hittites instead of us because they're different from us, and we'll lose them. They'll end up leaving the country. We'll lose the battle, and they'll leave the country, go back with the Hittites. And you can see here, he wants to keep their labor. They're maybe not yet fully slaves, but they are certainly serving the nation of Egypt in big ways. So at this point, he makes them full-on slaves. So he puts slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. Now, of anything, I mean, this almost should be definitive, right? This is not literally the name of the Pharaoh, but one of the cities that the king commands them to build is named Ramses. Could it be any more blatant, right? Do you think Egyptian kings might have had a tendency to name cities after themselves? Yes, that was something they did all the time. So very clear that it is Ramses we're dealing with here. Ramses built lots of stuff, mostly in mud brick, which is what we see the Israelites working with. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And this is something that's been true of God's people throughout the ages. The more the people of God are oppressed, the more we multiply and spread. We're like a good disease. We're like, I don't know what we are. Not a disease. Something good that can spread throughout the world. Salt and light. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Everyone's terrified of them, and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. And in all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Notice how often it's repeated. They are harshly oppressed now. Now they're not just working for Egypt, they are being seriously mistreated. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. So these two midwives, we don't actually know for sure if they are Hebrews. Hebrew midwives, in the Hebrew text, it says midwives of the Hebrews. Some people think they're Egyptians, but probably they are Hebrews. These two names are more like Hebrew names than they are like Egyptian names. So two Hebrew midwives are told to kill all the baby boys. Their job, their calling in life, is to deliver babies, help the women survive and the babies survive, and they're told to do the opposite if the baby is a boy. And you got this interesting line that I will also highlight because I think it will really help bring this story to life for you. It's so remarkable what's said here, the detail, the level of detail in this story. Pharaoh says, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. Remarkable. What is actually written in the Hebrew here is not delivery stool. If you were to very literally translate what Pharaoh says, he says, when you are helping the Hebrew women and they are between the stones, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. What in the world does it mean, the Hebrew, between the stones? This is one of the many indications in Exodus that it's really a document that came from people who lived in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians gave birth on stones, magical birthing stones. This is what they did. This is the only one that's ever been found. There are lots of pictures of them. What they would do is they would actually kneel on these stones and someone would hold them up. These stones were blessed by the priests and were believed to give all kinds of power. And this one is really beat up because it's super old. This one is from about 400 years before the Exodus. but it shows depictions of all kinds of good things, like blessings on the baby. It's a magical birthing stone. And so just the very fact, the little details in Exodus tell us it is from that time. And it tells us something that the Hebrews are actually taking over a lot of Egyptian practices. The Hebrews are supposed to be worshiping the Lord, the one true God, right? Here they seem to be using Egyptian magic during their births, during delivery. Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. So between the stones, kill them. The text goes on, the midwives, however, feared God. They feared God. And they did not do what the Egyptian king had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? I'll pause right there just to point out a number of things about this story. Number one, we're in the first chapter of Exodus here. And who are the heroes that we're being told about? Right from the very beginning of this book, the heroes are not anyone you would expect. The heroes are two otherwise unknown women. Do you know how rare that is for an ancient document to begin with women, unknown women, as the heroes of the story? So rare that this is the only one. It doesn't happen anywhere except in the Bible. It doesn't happen anywhere except in the Bible. What is the message? Well, there's a number of messages being given to the people of Israel through this. Anyone can be a hero used to do God's will. Anyone. Anyone who has faith, who trusts in the Lord, who fears God. Not meaning they're terrified of God all the time, that he's going to strike them or something. Meaning they care more about what God thinks than what Pharaoh thinks. And I also want you to think about for a minute what the pressure must have been like in that society to just go ahead and do what Pharaoh told them to do. The pressure must have been absolutely immense. It is easy for us to look back and go, oh, that's so evil, right? That Pharaoh would want them to kill all the baby boys, right? Killing babies is evil. How could any society ever just be okay with that? And yet every society, almost every society in history has been okay with it. I mean, you know what they did? They just didn't think about it. That's what they did. Just like us. I mean, right now, there are abortions going on within 10 kilometers of us, no doubt. We just don't think about it, just like they didn't. And what must the pressure on those two women must have been like? I'm sure even many of the Israelites, wanted them not to kill the babies, especially the moms, right? But I'm sure others, like in ancient societies especially, it was often even considered an honor, right, to sacrifice your life for the good of the group, right? Maybe these babies, it's okay. You know, Pharaoh's the god. We've got to sacrifice some of our babies, not all of them, just the firstborn sons, just the male children. We got to sacrifice them. We don't want Pharaoh to come and destroy everything we have or make things even worse for us. I am sure, just because we know how people are, that even many Israelites would have told them, just go along with it. Just do what Pharaoh's telling you to do. But in the face of this immense, immense pressure, two regular women, just regular people, they say, no, there is a God, and he does not want me to do this. So I'm just not going to do it. They let the boys live. The king of Egypt summoned the midwives. Imagine this moment. You remember looking at that picture of the temple. Imagine what it was like to be in the presence of the Pharaoh of Egypt. He summoned the midwives before him and said, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh. This is actually kind of hilarious. Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, Pharaoh. They're vigorous. They're not like your weak women. They're vigorous and they give birth before the midwives arrive. Now, number one, they're lying to Pharaoh, okay? They were there helping with all the births. They didn't give birth before they arrived. Number two, I mean, it's kind of a blatantly obvious lie. I mean, even if it were true, Pharaoh could just say, well, why didn't you kill them as soon as you arrived? Like, what's the difference? I think mostly what this is a way of resisting Pharaoh, telling him that they're just not going to do what he says without directly insulting him to his face, right? Pharaoh, sure, they trust God, but to say to Pharaoh, hey, even though you think you're God and you rule this whole nation, but hey, we're just not going to do what you say, it would have been an instant death sentence for sure. I mean, God could have miraculously saved them, but it would have been an instant death sentence. But it's not lost on Pharaoh that they are not doing what he says, and yet he does not kill them in this moment. God was kind to the midwives. Somehow they're spared, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Often midwives were women who had not been able to have children, and so that became their job, their role in the community. He gave them families of their own. They were able to conceive. So then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Now he calls on his own officials and soldiers, perhaps. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, which means kill and throw into the Nile. But let every girl live. Once again, you can see what were regular people in Egypt doing? They just weren't thinking about this. Why throw the babies into the Nile? Because then they get washed downstream. And you don't have to look at this obviously evil thing that you did. This is the condition of oppression that the Israelites are in. That's the end of chapter 1. And just let's wrap up with a few points. You probably don't have any of your fill in the blanks. I think I put them all at the end today. But just a few things we can draw from this story. The Lord, and again, we're going to be using that term, referring to this one particular God, the true God, the God who made the heaven and the earth, the God who called forward Abraham from Ur in ancient Babylon, the God who sent his son Jesus to die for us. This particular God, the one true God, the Lord calls us to resist evil. No matter how persuasive it is, no matter how good the arguments are that, you just got to do this so that some other good stuff can happen, the Lord calls us to resist evil. That's an act of faith. That's how the midwives trusted him. The big lesson, I think, of the story of these midwives is that we need to fear the Lord more than we fear people. What does that mean? If we were going to put it in different words, I would say this: worry about what the Lord thinks more than what people think. Very often, especially if you analyze your own mind, most people spend most of their time worried about what other people think. That is natural, so don't beat yourself up over it. But you must work toward and ask God to work in you toward becoming a person who cares, who worries more about what the Lord thinks than what the people around you think. That's who the midwives had become. We also see in this story that the Lord is sovereign over history and over your life. That's an important word, sovereign. It means he's totally in control, but he is not controlling. He does not make you do stuff, but somehow he is still totally in control over all the chaos in history and in our lives. He leads. He takes us where he wants us to go and still gives us free will. And that's where we're going to wrap up for today. We'll continue next week, moving more into the story of Moses and learning more about this incredible road to freedom, this example and pathway that God has made for us to follow. Let's pray.